Thank you all for watching. This week's topic is going to be public transportation as a retrofit for auto-oriented cities that are slowly growing or even in slight decline. 2 weeks ago I made such a video which was very long, but I will attempt to upload it on the same topic, but not for stagnant cities, but for very fast growing ones or ones where there's future demand for growth. So I was talking about the success of the sea train in Calgary and what it might mean for cities like Los Angeles. And I was also talking about some other American Sunbelt cities like Atlanta or Dallas, but less so just because I'm less familiar with them. Now, because the growth part was very important to that video, discussing the same question of retrofit for a region that is not very fast growing is going to look profoundly different. And this means, so in the same way that when you try to, whenever you try to build transit, you want to use whatever local features that work for you as you can, and the reason is that the issue is cities are not actually commodities. To some extent, and I emphasize to some extent, suburbs are, in the sense that American suburbia does its best to be as commoditized as possible. Cities are not. Cities always have these little unique features. Sometimes they overrate their own unique features, like when New York has its own separate set of supermarket chains that are distinct and more expensive from everyone else's in America. But usually there are features that are unavoidable. So these might be whether a city is rich or poor, whether whether the local geography is very open, or whether it's constrained by mountains, a river, coastline. So I encourage people to look for the commissioner's plan for New York, 1807, 1811. I believe they were charged with doing it in 1807 and they reported in 1811. This was the plan that established the Manhattan Grid, in which they explicitly were referring to the city's uniquely constrained geography, namely the fact that the Hudson and the East River are both incredibly wide, so it's not as easy to bridge them as it is to bridge, let's say, the Seine or the Thames. So there are always going to be special features, and this is no different when you're trying to retrofit a city with public transportation. So with a growing city, the feature that you're trying to incorporate would be the growth part. So because a city like Houston or Dallas or Calgary or Atlanta has very high actual growth, you will try to use public transit in order to ensure that this ongoing growth reinforces public transportation. And this was indeed done in Calgary. It was also done in Vancouver so completely to the point that people don't recognize how much Vancouver is basically a Sunbelt city when it comes to growth. Obviously no matter. Likewise, with a stagnant city, you will use its special features as a stagnant city. Oh, hi Diego. So what does it mean? So with a stagnant city, we do not have the ability to shape future growth very much. You can do it at a very small scale. So one example of this is Lille. Lille is, I think at this point, is the 5th or 6th largest metropolitan region within France. The largest are Paris, then Lyon, then Marseille. Traditionally, Lille was 4th, but because of its stagnation, I believe it was recently overtaken by both Toulouse and Bordeaux. So Lille is very much the Rust Belt of France. It is one of the, in fact, this region, Nord-Pas-de-Calais, I think it might actually be the poorest region of France on the borders that Google is showing. So these are the pre-2015 borders. France did some mergers in 2015. So Nord-Pas-de-Calais, I believe, merged with Picardy. But on the pre-2015 borders, this is the poorest, I believe, region of metropolitan France. Metropolitan means mainland. So I think it might actually be poor. I think it might actually be less poor, sorry, than maybe Corsica and maybe also Auvergne, which is a region that you probably have never heard of for good reason. But it's either the poorest or bottom three in any case. Very deindustrialized, closed mining regions, and the station. But something that it makes it very easy to miss from the train is that they did do some redevelopment around L'Île Europe. This is the TGV station with through service, so you can get service to Paris, but you can also get service to Brussels and to London. So kind of uniquely for the TGV system, this is a through station that is built anew in city center. It is part of an urban renewal project. And the few blocks around L'Île Europe look kind of nice, but everything else is very poor. And this contrasts with, for example, Marseille. The region around Marseille is nowhere near as poor. It's not even actually objectively that poor. It's just that in Marseille, around the train station, you see the poverty. So people have this kind of meme that Marseille is too poor to be real France, and nobody says the same of Lille. So my point is that you do have public transportation in stagnant cities, and you will use their. So what does it mean, stagnation? Yes, you can create a little bit of growth, and I discussed this in one of my high-speed rail posts. That you could, if you have very good high-speed rail to, let's not do deprecated Boston Crab. That if you, for example, have good high-speed rail to New York City, then you could, for example, pretty up a couple blocks near downtown. In Cleveland. That's the example that I gave because my American high-speed rail crayon, which I'm going to show people. So that map has a lot of service to Cleveland, just because Cleveland lies at the convergence of lines to both east and west. So I don't want to call it like the gateway to the west or something because it's the gateway to the Midwest maybe, but because of Cleveland's location, there's going to be a lot of high-speed rail service from here if this network is built. But this is only a few blocks. So yes, there is some growth demand, but it's very weak. It's only going to be a few blocks. So we could discuss this later, but this cannot be most of the system. Instead, what does it mean for a city to be stagnant? It means that in relative terms, it is less important than it used to be. This is what it means. This is what stagnation means. It can be actual reduction in population, although usually it's not a big reduction. So I think Buffalo at this point is maybe 20% off its post-war peak population at the level of the metropolitan area. The city itself has declined much more. But even 20% is very unusual. Usually it's things that are basically stagnant, maybe 5% off, like Detroit, Cleveland, I think St. Louis maybe, Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is an interesting example that I'm not going to use because of how weird it is, where population is declining but incomes are actually up. Essentially the steel industry is in decline, but Pittsburgh has a lot of tech, and the growth in the tech in Pittsburgh is creating income growth, but maybe in the future it will also lead to population growth, but at this point it's not countering the exodus as the remains of traditional manufacturing are in steady decline. So again, usually stagnation does not mean that you're worse off, especially when we talk about income stagnation. So here's the question: which city is richer today? Detroit? Which city is richer? Detroit today, or Detroit of 60 years ago? The unambiguous answer is Detroit today is a lot richer. Now, Detroit happens to be one of the poorest cities in America. You can even find some social problems in Detroit today that are worse than they were 60 years ago. I believe the crime rate 60 years ago was not unusually high then. But in general, poverty in America 60 or 70 years ago meant that you literally could not afford food. There were people who were actually going hungry. Maybe not so much in Detroit. Detroit was one of the richer parts of America. So the actual hunger might be in the South, especially, or in Appalachia. But urban poverty too meant that you had substandard housing, cockroaches, for example, very common. To this day, almost people in New York tell cockroaches joke because the housing quality in New York is kind of stagnant. Of course, New York has many things that are not stagnant. But in most of America, the housing quality has improved. The worst buildings were knocked down. So Detroit today is not poorer than it was 60 years ago. However, in relative terms, it absolutely is. Detroit in the 50s and 60s was one of the wealthier metropolitan regions of the United States. The United States at the time was also, relatively speaking, a lot wealthier than the rest of, especially the developed world. There was a lot of convergence in developed world income between the end of World War II roughly and about the 1980s. And since the 1980s, it's mostly stopped. Essentially, Europe has settled into an equilibrium of similar productivity to the United States, but shorter working hours. But for example, Branko Milanovic, who has a lot of really good inequality graphs. One of his many graphs is the Gini index for people, not for countries, I believe, restricted to the developed world. And it shows a decline in the developed world Gini through 1980, and since then stagnation. And for this reason, so the point is that the Detroit of the 50s, the city I think already then is poorer than the suburbs, but and is already undergoing white flight. But the city is not viewed as poor until well into the 60s. So relatively speaking, the Detroit of the past is much richer than the America of the past. Which in turn is much richer than the world of the past. But this is a moving target. Wealth today is just higher. So the sort of things that post-war America used as keeping up with the Joneses type of status display. So that would be having a car, having a separate car for every adult in the family, having a television, having a color television, having an air conditioner, having a washing machine and a dryer. Earlier it would have also been having a refrigerator. All of these things used to be things that you would save up money for. So maybe in the United States it was in the 50s. I know in Israel it was a thing that you saved money for in the 70s, even 80s. But today, I mean, everyone has that. I mean, if you don't have air conditioning in a developing country, not in developing, in developed country, it's because either it's Europe where people don't grasp air conditioning, or it's New York where in New York the housing stock is kind of stagnant, but everything else in New York isn't. So the stagnation is relative. This is something that's very important to point out. So the first lesson of when I talk about relative stagnation, it's you do not try to restore a glorious past in the 50s. The glorious past of the 50s, even in America, even in the Midwest of even the Midwestern United States, was poorer than it is today. So you don't want to just, for example, restore old streetcars that were removed. That would not be terribly useful. And it would also serve the geography of the 1950s, which was a lot more centralized than that of today. All of these cities have horrendous job sprawl. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson, I'm going to start zooming in, not so much on Detroit, but on Cleveland. It's maybe a better example. So this is Cleveland at eye altitude. I'm going to zoom in to, let's say, 50 kilometers. I don't actually know if you guys can see this because of, so I'm going to, okay, so I'm gonna try to move. Actually, maybe I can also shrink myself. I don't think you guys really just want to watch me model. also dysphoria. But anyway, so this is Cleveland, roughly at eye altitude of 50 kilometers. And what we're going to point out is that there's a wealth of railways through Cleveland. So on my map, this is a rather skeletal high-speed rail map because this is how high-speed rail works. It's a much smaller network, always in the old railway network, just because it's for a, I won't say more urbanized, but maybe more large city-ized kind of geography. So it's not urbanized in the sense of a manufacturing town of 40,000. It's urbanized in the sense of a metropolitan area of 4 million. And there are just fewer of these. But even then, Cleveland here is the hub, and you can even see that here, Cleveland's role is the hub. So you have all these different commuter lines that could be restored. Now, they were never thought of as commuter lines. I do not actually know to what extent the United States ever built a dedicated commuter rail line. Even lines that you might think of as pure commuter rail, like the Long Island Railroad. The LIRR was actually first built as a connection between New York and Boston, with ferry connections at both ends, because they thought that the Connecticut route was unbuildable because it was too hilly. And this is why the LIRR was built through the interior of the island before the Industrial Revolution. So this would be 1830s, so very early industrial. This area was basically unpopulated. The population lived on the coast. And to this day, you can see sometimes two different centers of the same town. So this would be Huntington. You can kind of see the old center of Huntington that is close to the coast, and then Huntington Station, where the LIR is. You see this even more so in New England, which had more of its growth being pre-industrial. But anyway, the point is that in Cleveland, you have a wealth of I shouldn't so call them commuter lines because they were predominantly intercity. You can even see the cities that they connect to. So things like Akron, Canton, Youngstown, and then Pittsburgh. Two different lines toward Erie, and then Buffalo. A bunch of lines going west. So. Some of these lines are going to end up in Chicago, some aren't. I think all of the lines can be made to end up in Chicago, depending on how circuitous they want to go. And I don't remember the names of all of these railroads. If I did, I would start rattling off which one is the PRR, which one is the New York Central, and so on. But the point is that you have lots and lots of old rail lines, and the reason is, remember, Cleveland is stagnant. So Cleveland, there is a region of the bare metropolitan statistical area, not the broader one, is about 2, I think, million people, maybe a little bit more. So it's 2 million people without any growth. So this means that this would have been 2 million people generations ago. And if this was 2 million people generations ago, at the time, railroads were how freight got around. Railroads were how people got around between cities. So obviously this would be served by many railroads. And again, I'm going to show you what Cleveland is like at this zoom level. Now I do want to caution that Detroit developed slightly later than the other big Rust Belt cities because of the auto industry there. So Detroit was Detroit was a big Midwestern city in 1900, but it was not among the biggest. It only became the second biggest after Chicago in the 1910s and 20s because of the growth of the auto industry, and by then railroads were mostly no longer built. So when we're talking about stagnation, there's this annoying window of Detroit which was only in its heyday between, let's say, the 1920s and 50s, and in Detroit you do see railroads, but you might notice there are fewer of these. And in Cleveland, Detroit is a larger city than Cleveland, so it should have more, but it has fewer. So this is the situation in Detroit, which again is very unique. But even Detroit has a bunch of railroads. Now let's look at, let's say, St. Louis. This is a metropolitan area, again the same size. I mean, I don't want to start rating which one is bigger and which one isn't, because it's weird things regarding how you which satellite cities fall into the orbit. And you kind of see there's a lot of these lines. So maybe there's just one east-west trunk line, I guess, and the north-south along the river, back when rivers were thought of as industrial more than recreational. But you can kind of see how, let's go to again about 50 to be comparable with Cleveland. Close enough. So you can kind of see, why did I click this? You can kind of see that there's so many lines fanning out of St. Louis. And now St. Louis is a river city. The Mississippi is very wide, so it's not very rich in bridges. I mean, you can actually count them even at this zoom level. But you can kind of have the north-south line, the north-south line on the right bank of the Mississippi, and then you have the main east-west with branches, and I don't think they were ever used as trunks this way. It's just different railroads, and maybe they formed union stations, but you see many lines just because St. Louis has the rail network of a city that was this large more than 100 years ago. St. Louis, I think. So I believe that Missouri was at one point the fourth most populous state in the United States. I think it actually at one point was New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and then Missouri. Or maybe I'm wrong, and Missouri was number 5 and number 4 was Ohio. But Missouri had a very large population. So St. Louis has this history. And now, so these are cities of about 2.5, 3 million maybe. Now let's look at a city of 3 million that is not as historic, and I'm going to use the most extreme example, which is Orlando. The CSA in Orlando is bigger, it's 4 million, but the MSA is maybe just 2.5. So this is Orlando. This is the extent of mainline rail in Orlando. So yes, you can find some branches. Note, I'm not 50, I'm 25. And if I'm 50, 50, there's basically one line. It's a north-south-ish main line through the city, and you can find some branches, but the branches are industrial. They do not have any development near them, even though Orlando is a fast-growing city. Now you could say, okay, Orlando is fast-growing, so let's try to do residential redevelopment around these. But even then, the city is very poor in legacy railways, because at the time legacy railways were being built, Florida, I think, had like 3 congressional districts. So this is the most extreme case, but you can even look at intermediate cases. So that would be something like Charlotte or Nashville. Charlotte has more railways, don't get me wrong. Charlotte is not Orlando. But I think Charlotte has has a smaller extent of railways than, for example, Cleveland or St. Louis, even though it's of comparable size. And again, you can look at things like Nashville. And by the way, east of Mississippi except Florida, will have more railways that you could leverage. Again, fewer usually, but they do exist. And then when you look at stuff like Florida, or the sort of things that used to be called Sunbelt in the 60s, back when nobody would call Nashville or Charlotte Sunbelt, they were just the South. So that would be things like San Antonio or Austin. All of these have very little mainline rail, because again, they were just very small at the time mainline rail was being built. So this is Austin. At our chosen zoom level. There are two trunks. One goes north-south through the city, one goes from city center in 2 directions and doesn't even meet the other trunk. Austin is a metropolitan area, is not that much smaller than Cleveland. San Antonio has more. San Antonio is older, so slower growing in a sense than Austin, Dallas, or Houston. But even in San Antonio, growth is high by non-Texan standards, and the extent of the railway, again, it's much more so than in Austin, you might notice, but it's still very small compared with the coverage that one sees in Cleveland. So the first lesson for stagnant cities is don't try to be too technologically MAGA and try to restore the world of 3 generations ago. And the second lesson is, if you're stagnant, it means that you were large maybe 100 years ago. And if you're large 100 years ago, you will have railways. You will have a legacy network to work with. So you will not have a legacy streetcar network, because even when some skeleton of it remained, for example, the trolley buses of Dayton. So Dayton, so for people who do not know, when you think of trolley buses in America, you probably might be thinking of San Francisco, you might be thinking of Vancouver, I know, not America, or Seattle, but actually Dayton, Ohio also has a network. I do not know the history behind why it exists, I just know that it does. But usage on this network is not high. Maybe it's higher than bus systems in cities of comparable size to Dayton, but that would be higher than numbers that are basically infinitesimal anyway. But Dayton, so Dayton has that skeleton of a trolleybus network, but it's not being used very intensively. And again, I don't know Dayton well enough to tell you exactly why or what's exactly going on there. And if the streetcars had ever survived, as they did in New Orleans has legacy streetcars. The ridership consists of approximately 5 people, and many of them are tourists. So the legacy that is being preserved, it's not exactly the transportation network, because all of these cities have undergone extensive job sprawl. So lesson number 1 is don't try to restore the world of 60 or 70 years ago. Number 2, if you're a stagnant city, you are likely to, and if you're a stagnant city, it's not a small town, so not, let's say, Mansfield. If you're a stagnant city like Cleveland, then you're likely to have been big relative to the definitions of a big city of 70 or 100 years ago, and this means that you're likely to have been equipped with a large mainline rail network. Lesson number 3 is be mindful of job sprawl. So I could just crayon commuter rail here. I think I in fact did so for Madison, Wisconsin, as a, I think it was mostly as a joke. I can show people the crayon, but it's not going to be terribly interesting. I can show you the network on which a crayon was based. So you can kind of see that you have a bunch of different branches. And Madison is kind of a weird case. Madison is not really Rust Belt. It's not stagnant. It's within Wisconsin, so that makes it Rust Belt. But it is, but it was not an important industrial city back in the golden age of railways, and the result is that you might notice something about the direction of these lines. A through main line from Chicago to Minneapolis would not go northeast to southwest. It would go southeast to northwest. And in fact, none of the 3 main lines that competed for Chicago to Minneapolis service, these would be the Q, which is currently BNSF. So that is, they actually left Chicago going south and then went up the Mississippi. I'm forgetting which bank. You had the Milwaukee, which is the route that Amtrak uses, and then but it takes the name of the Q because west of Minneapolis it runs on the historic, not Milwaukee, but Great Northern tracks, which merged with the Q to form BNSF. So that would be the Milwaukee, which is I believe this one. So this would be via La Crosse. And finally, you have the Chicago and Northwestern line, also through Milwaukee, but farther north, which is currently Union Pacific. So I believe that that line ends up going through Eau Claire, but maybe even farther north. But the point is that none of these 3 lines even served Madison. But Madison, because of its weird geography on an isthmus that points in the wrong direction, does have usable, wait, why am I saying Madison when I'm pointing at Beaver Dam? Madison, this Madison, the real Madison on the isthmus here, does actually have lines that could be used for commuter lines, but I mean, why would anyone use them? I mean, like if I restored 15-minute service from Sun Prairie to Madison, I'm sure some people would use it, but how many people even work on the isthmus? So this is the problem. You need to be mindful of the problem of job sprawl. By the way, can you not say mister? I mean, yeah, I know that it's kind of weird with honorifics for non-binary people because the language of honorifics is an incredibly trad language. I mean, think what the word sir means. Sir means you're a knight. Mister, I guess, is a corruption of master. Or I guess Herr in German, same thing. It means knight. Sieur is in monsieur in French. I mean, that's I think. I mean, obviously it's sir, but I do not know. I think that might actually be the title that you use to refer to a baron. So yeah, so Melbourne, yes, Melbourne has legacy tramways. So I'm going to talk about America, and not about Canada or Australia. And the reason is that Canada and Australia have a lot less job sprawl. Essentially, Canada and Australia, they're not Rust Belt. None of the, I mean, maybe you could find small cities that are Rust Belty. I mean, maybe in Atlantic Canada or something, but people don't really live there very much. People in Canada mostly live in growing cities or in Montreal, so they live in Toronto, which is fast growing, Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver. I mean, Canada is very urbanized this way, and Australia is the same thing. And I know the history for Calgary and Vancouver. I can only surmise what it was for Australia, but it's not that they had extensive job sprawl and then fixed it. It's that they kept building up their central business district. So as they were transitioning from, let's say, an old style downtown to a larger city with the downtown that is centered on professional services, they actually made sure that they would all stay downtown rather than suburbanize to office parks. So in the same way that Tokyo is not a good example for how you can retrofit an auto-oriented city, because Tokyo was literally never auto-oriented, or Seoul is an even better example. The metropolitan Seoul, so that would be Seoul, Incheon, and Gyeonggi region, the trip to work model split for that region is 50%. This is higher than any city for which I have data other than Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Singapore. I think it actually beats Vienna, but I want to say probably beats Vienna, but I'm not 100% certain. And just think how good Vienna needs to be for this to even be a question. But it's not a 50%, it's a recent rise. The 50% is actually maybe a slight decline from 20 years ago. Not a big one, but maybe it was 52%. It's just, so in the same way that Tokyo and Seoul never had the transit decline that is that other cities in, for example, the Western world have and are arresting, Canadian cities never had the extent of job sprawl of America because they just made better planning decisions in the 70s and the 80s. In Toronto's case, it would go back even further. And the result is that Vancouver, which again, if you look at the growth rates of Vancouver, it's basically the Sun Belt. And yet, Vancouver has retained job concentration in city center, which I don't mean the small downtown peninsula, I mean the city, a job concentration that is comparable to that of New York City, San Francisco, Boston, Paris. Vancouver might actually be somewhat ahead of those American cities. I think it's behind Paris, but not by much. So lots of job concentration, and I mean, yes, they did a lot of commercial TOD. You can even see all the skyscrapers in Vancouver. But these were for replacing declining small industries. I mean, I don't think there was a lot of manufacturing here. The manufacturing would have been port facilities and so on, but as cities shifted toward professional services, they just kept them downtown. They just kept the jobs downtown. Again, it would have been different jobs, but they never underwent the office parkization that one saw in America, even very early on. For example, Silicon Valley, the office parks go back to the 50s. So this is why I'm going to not talk about Melbourne's tramway system, or about Toronto's streetcars, or about the sea trains. This is about taking regions that do not have public transportation. In Detroit, the model split for trips to work is 1% in the metropolitan region. In Cleveland, it might be a little bit higher. I don't remember. But if it's a little bit higher, it's 2%. It's not going to be any higher. So you take these regions where you basically do not have public transportation, and you need to change them so that they do have public transportation. So it's a different thing, and it's more difficult. I don't think it's impossible. It is possible. It requires a lot of political will that is a political will that I don't want to say is absent, because it's not that nobody in Cleveland wants to change it. I think everyone in Cleveland understands that Cleveland is in decline. And I say this having never been to Cleveland. The only parts of the Midwest that I have been to are Chicago and Ann Arbor. I know more about the Midwest through certain Midwestern urbanists. So, for example, Aaron Run, who is from Indianapolis and Chicago. I do not actually know whether he lives in one of these or in New York nowadays. But he would talk constantly about the Midwest and its culture of decline, its culture of declinism, that everyone understands that they're in decline, but and want this to change, but don't really know how to do so, or are not very good at it, or don't pull in the same direction. So getting everyone to pull in the same direction toward, like, it's kind of understanding that Cleveland needs to think of itself as a city that geographically should be, let's say, Boston, might be a challenge, but again, I don't think it's impossible. But it is difficult. And the difficulty is that two things need to happen at the same time. So remember the three lessons. Stagnation is about relative decline, not absolute decline. There's a lot of historic railways, and there's a lot of job sprawl. And I'm actually going to go and poke around just to show you guys the job sprawl, and this is something that I did not pre-compute, and this means that I could be wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not look, so I don't do the city concentration metric, where I look at jobs within a carefully chosen blob of about 100 square kilometers. This is my favorite metric for this, and the reason it's my favorite metric is that Parisian data that I've found is only at the municipal or arrondissement level, rather than the block level, and Paris and La Défense together are about 100 square kilometers. So it's very much me not even being numerological, because 100 is a round number. It's me looking at where the data is available. I understand that I'm being constrained by data availability. And the reason I'm not going to do that is just because it takes a long time to gerrymander the correct blob of 100 square kilometers in an American city. Especially one that I'm not familiar with, so I can't just draw knowing where all the secondary job centers are. Instead, I'm going to do the easier metric, where I'm going to pick a point, ideally the historic train station, and look at jobs within a kilometer. So I'm going to slightly cheat in Cleveland. So in Cleveland, you can look at the historic train station. This is this one. It is very centrally located. It has a single daily train, and it serves Cleveland at night in both directions. I think maybe 3 in the morning or 4 or 5 in the morning, because it's a night train between New York and Chicago, for which Cleveland is held to be unimportant. Instead of looking at this station, I'm gonna gerrymander and look at Tower City. So here, part of my station radius is wasted. I want to say wasted on fish, but I don't think there are actually fish on the coast. I think it's too polluted. So it's wasted, let's call it, on water. Um, yeah, so there is more. So eds and meds, like in Madison, do give you more. They do give you more job concentration, and this is very useful. Um, but the job concentration. But first of all, most of these cities are not university cities. Second, most of the, second, words. And second, even then, I mean, it's not a lot of job concentration. So I'm going to do this radius. This is 1 kilometer. You are free to call me a fucking nerd for knowing, for having memorized how many miles to a kilometer, because I've done this so many times. So this is the area around around the center of Cleveland. Let's look at the job count here. It's not going to be very large. And I don't even know what number I'm going to see because I didn't pick it. Okay, so this is 80,000. Now, 80,000 could be worse because Providence is 30,000. Now, I will point out this is not the train station. But in Providence too, I mean, the train station is not optimally located. If you do the actual train station, so that would be here, it should be less than this. I don't think it should be much less than this just because of saying where the in which direction the blobs go. But the point is that 80,000, that's not a lot. This is, remember, a metropolitan region where, excluding Canton and Akron, which are the combined statistical area, so even excluding, so this is the mall, so this is where the train station is. So again, I expect this to be a smaller but not much smaller number just because of station radius issues. So instead of 76,000, this is going to be 67. Okay, 67,000. Now, how many jobs are there in the Cleveland region? Now, I don't remember. So I'm going to need to actually search because I don't remember Cleveland, because I don't remember which counties are included. So let's do clear selection, draw points, do not buffer, and I'm going to do the counties. The counties layer, so if I click, so what this means is that if I click anywhere within the county, it gives me the entire county. So I don't need to try to trace around the borders of the county. So I have Cuyahoga. I do not know how to pronounce this. Is this Geauga or Joga? Lake, Lorraine, and Medina. And let me just move south just in case my face is covering these up. So Cuyahoga, Lake, the county that I can't pronounce, Lorraine, and Medina. Geauga. Okay. So, Geauga, Cuyahoga, Lake, Medina, and Lorraine. Confirm selection. So, wait, is this right? Yes, it is. So, how many jobs do we see in that? Oh, there is an MSA layer? Yeah, okay, so around Brussels, okay, so first of all, I would not even draw Brussels Central, I would draw Brussels South, Midi, I guess. Okay, so this is 1 million jobs. So 6% of the jobs are in a radius of 1 kilometer around the station. And, okay, that gets you a non-trivial volume of commuters, but it's not a large volume of commuters, and the problem is, so you want to do two things at once. You want to increase this number from 67,000 to something a little larger, and you don't need to be within 1 kilometer radius. This is something that I was using for studying outlying stations on commuter rail, where we absolutely are constrained to a 1 kilometer radius, but especially when we're thinking intercity, 2 or 3, maybe even 10 kilometers sometimes are useful. I emphasize sometimes. But the problem is you need to simultaneously raise this and create ways that people can get to these jobs. So the problem is also professional services are rather 9 to 5 focused. Now they're not as 9 to 5 focused as they used to be. The concentration of 9 to 5-ness in New York, for example, in Midtown, is in a steady multi-decade trend of decline. So the peak is smaller than it used to be in Midtown Manhattan, in like the Manhattan core. And we know that this cannot be any kind of replacement of, for example, very regimented industrial 9 to 5 jobs, because there were already basically no industrial jobs in Manhattan 40 years ago, or even more than 40 years ago. So we do see a trend of decline of 9 to 5-ness, but it's still very 9 to 5. Now usually 9 to 5 transit lives off of the existence of congestion. Now this is the fourth lesson that we're going to have to remember. So remember, lesson number 1: stagnant is not actual decline in the sense that you're literally poorer than you used to be. Second lesson is if you're stagnant, you're likely to have a large mainline rail network because you used to be big, relatively speaking. Third lesson is job growth. Fourth lesson, you're not going to have traffic. I know nothing about how much traffic there is in Cleveland, I will say, or in Detroit. I can look up the TTI tables for this. The one example that I do know is something that I learned from Rochester, another city that I have never been to, but I know people but I know people from Rochester because I used to, in math academia, I used to collaborate with a lot of people at Rochester. And we would sometimes talk about things that are not arithmetic dynamics, and one of these things might be the urban layout. And I was told that the inner loop of Rochester, you could drive in the middle of the day and literally count individual cars that were passing you in the opposite direction. This is how uncongested it was. And as a result, the inner loop, you might notice something about the inner loop. It is not a loop anymore because you might notice that so you might notice that the eastern side of it is not a freeway, and you might and if you pay attention to the layout, you might notice that it is transitional. Okay, this is not how an intact boulevard looks, right? This looks when you've just demolished things to build a freeway, or when you've just demolished a freeway. In this case, it's the latter. The freeway was demolished due to local civic activism, which again I know about because I happened to be talking to professors at Rochester, and I might have heard similar things. If I talk to people at Case Western, at Wayne State, at Sunny Buffalo, so they brought it down just because it had very little traffic, and they were trying to do it as a kind of urban healing. I don't want to say regeneration, because urban regeneration is kind of the British term for urban renewal, and usually renewal is the things that were built with the freeways in the 50s and 60s, but the sort of things that you see Secretary Buttigieg giving grants to cities to maybe cap freeways. I don't think he has the guts to say we need to demolish freeways in the Rust Belt. It is necessary. It is good for these cities. But the sort of people who have a very resentful political identity and believe in declinism and believe in political MAGAism think that, they have abandoned the cities a long time ago. I mean, if you look at how Cleveland voted, how Rochester voted, how Detroit voted, they did not vote for Donald Trump. But people in exurbs of these cities with a very anti-city identity did. And as a result, I don't think they feel politically empowered to say more freeways need to come down. They talk about capping. So there's going to be lots of freeways. They're not going to be congested. There's not going to be any parking crunch because let's look for, so I'm already in Rochester, so let's look at Rochester. And you might notice all the parking creators. Now, if you were on Twitch 2 weeks ago with me, you saw me do this not for Rochester, but for Nashville versus Calgary. So let's do Rochester and let's do Calgary again afterward. So this is I guess, so this is a plaza, I guess. But you see parking. If we zoom in, we're going to start seeing parking structures on a lot of these buildings. This building looks like it might be parking, I'm not sure. Parking. You have all this surface parking. And again, remember, so this is part of lesson number 4. We can even select lesson number 5. So lesson number 4 is lots of freeway capacity. Lesson number 5 is going to be lots of parking capacity, because all of these places took down mid-rise buildings that were depreciated in the 50s, 60s, 70s to replace them with parking, because they expected people to get to city center by car. This is why you had job sprawl. They literally took space that could be used for jobs and they turned it into parking because they thought this was absolutely necessary. Calgary instead took all this parking and redeveloped it. So in Calgary, there's just less job sprawl. And yes, they did use the fact that Calgary had fast growth, and yes, the construction of parking in the 50s, 60s, 70s in American cities was predicated on the assumption that they would keep growing. The decline of the Midwest was not telegraphed. They did not know that was going to happen. Note that here there are tall buildings, and they're not all of the buildings are tall, but there's just less parking. You don't have as much in the way of parking creators. So this is the Canadian equivalent. So in Cleveland, in Rochester, and in cities like that, you have abandonment, and it's not abandonment like in Detroit you can sometimes see, or even on the south side of Chicago you can zoom in on a random street. I don't even know whether I'm looking at a rate shop or a neighborhood. So you might notice that in this randomly selected, so this might be a more intact row, but even next to this more intact row, you have empty lots. These used to be buildings. This used to be a building. This used to be a building. This used to be a building. This used to be lots of buildings. So in the same way that so this is residential Detroit abandonment. Now it's not literal abandonment like you see in a post-apoc movie. These were replaced by what was thought to be the more modern use of land in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which was parking. And the result is they have all these parking creators in the centers of large cities. This means that we are not going to be able to just run trains there. We could. So you could say, okay, so you could start furiously crowning in Detroit. So the center of Detroit is separated by a freeway from the historic train station. And this is a problem, but if you really want, you can RER tunnel it. And say, okay, we're going to build a multi-line system. We're going to even use this connection. So we're going to do something that's going to connect you to Royal Oak. I don't know if you can actually hit anything interested in Grosse Pointe from this. We're going to build a maybe longer range regional rail line with a more intense commuter service on the inner part, where the regional rail line goes to Port Huron. We're going to do the same thing through Oakland County to Pontiac. Maybe even it's going to be a regional line to Flint. We're going to do a regional line to Ann Arbor, and maybe here there's actually intense demand all day for something like, I don't know, 15-minute service or something. And maybe or maybe 30 minutes, and then you're going to try to overlay something for Dearborn. And then the airport. You can do all of this, but by itself it will underperform. So in this case it will underperform just because the train station in Detroit is not a particularly exciting place job-wise. But even if it were, even if you could do it, an RER tunnel, remember, lesson number 4 is excess freeway capacity, lesson number 5 is excess parking capacity. So you need to have some kind of consensus as a region, which the region might have, I'm not sure. The state won't, for reasons of resentment, I think. And I don't know about the county, but because county level politics is just usually just terrible. But the same thing you could say in Cleveland. You could do all these regional lines, and they could succeed. The physical cost of doing so is not high because all of these lines pre-exist. You should probably electrify them. You should maybe, in some cases, you might need to construct new tracks or new junctions. So as an example, I was trying to crayon a line from Cleveland to Akron. Now there is this line that goes, first of all, it goes through a national park, and the National Park Service literally refuses to run any trains that are not heritage railways. But it also passes through a national park, which is not where you want a train to go. You want a train to go to where people live. National parks are famously wilderness, where man visits but does not stay. This is not where you're going to get high rail ridership. So instead you want to do something like this. So this line exists. The line from Hudson to Akron either has no freight or very little freight. The line from Hudson to Cleveland is part of the main line of, I believe, Norfolk Southern. But because it used to be the PRR main line, it has room for 4 tracks that you can restore. So it's money. I mean, it's not zero cost to do this. And you do need to worry about high American costs. You need to worry about high American costs whenever you touch mainline rail, especially. But I mean, it's 40 kilometers of quad track. I mean, it costs money, but it's what, very low 9 figures. And then maybe 100 million for electrification or something. I mean, again, it's money, but it's not obscene amounts of money. And in the case of, and you also always want to look for serendipitous occasions. So in this case, it's that the line in question kind of passes through where you see off downtown job concentration. And I guess I deleted it here, so I'm gonna go back to the Cleveland overlay, just the city this time. So Cleveland City is in Ohio. The alphabetization here puzzles me. And with, so this is, I believe, the Eds and Beds part of town. And yeah, so this would be the part of town where you have, so I believe this is the uni. This circle. So this is Euclid, slightly west of Stokes. This is Euclid. This one is, and where's Stokes? So Stokes is this one. So the job concentration is this. Now we're not passing through the job concentration, unfortunately, but we are passing reasonably close to it. We're passing here. So this is a place where you could absolutely run better bus service, or build light rail if you really want. You can have a station here with a transfer to the red line, which passes closer, around here. So it's not perfect, but it is not terrible, I don't think. This also gives you and if you have intense urban service, and this is actually high frequency corridor from Euclid, from this point of Euclid to city center, which is nothing. Remember, S1s are mostly urban; they're not suburban. And again, you can do these things. You can build a line to Euclid. So what you want is not to spend a lot of money. In New York, you need to spend money. I don't think New York needs to spend what New York thinks it needs to spend, because New York construction costs are awful. But in Cleveland, you don't need to dig new tunnels. New York needs to dig new tunnels. Now, these tunnels, I think, are justified by the population, by the wealth, by the demand for more housing in and around New York, but by the demand for more office space in Midtown Manhattan. But it's money. In Cleveland's case, it is a lot less money because restoration of service on existing track is not terribly expensive. Again, there are some obscene construction cost problems specifically for anything that touches mainline rail in American public transit. And this is true even if you build light rail in the same right of way, like with the case of the Green Line extension, where it's not quite the same, but some of the problems that led to high costs for GLX came from poor cooperation with operations for commuter rail, which was held to be its own thing. So, for example, they couldn't as easily work around, and they had to do construction at night, and they didn't even accelerate construction during Corona when there was no commuter rail ridership, and they could have just stopped running trains on that line. But the point is that you need to resolve the construction cost problem, and you also need to have an operating paradigm that is more S-Bahn or Regionalbahn than American commuter rail, but this is organizational. The concrete is not extensive, not at the scale of what's needed here. You need to invest in electronics, but that's still cheaper than concrete. So lots of organization, some electronics, very little concrete. This is where you want to be. In the best place you want to be, by the way, is Toronto. Toronto, let's look at the legacy rail network of Toronto for a moment, just to highlight how easy it is. You have all these commuter lines that only run rush hour. Fanning out of Union Station, there's already potential for through service, lots of extra tracks, so they are just electrifying it and improving frequencies and calling it an RER network, and unfortunately the costs are probably a factor of 4 too high because the benefits of doing it in a city like Toronto, so very big, very CBD centric, just look at all these tall buildings, very fast growing city, the ROI on this is so amazing that it looked outlandish, and because of surplus extraction, they just let the costs go to a factor of sometimes 2, sometimes 5 or more, higher than they should be. And even with all these costs, even with this obscene cost, I think the benefit-cost ratio is supposed to be something like 3. Now in Cleveland, you can't do that. Cleveland will never get the benefits of Toronto. Cleveland is a smaller city than Toronto. Cleveland has a lot of job sprawl repair to do. Cleveland is not fast growing. In fact, it's not growing at all. Cleveland will never have the benefits of Toronto. It means it cannot have the costs of Toronto. But you know something like the Toronto system, built for normal costs, not Toronto costs, could be the skeleton of something. But again, you need to get a lot of ducks in a row. So you need to probably reduce car capacity. This means you identify parking lots and develop them. There might not even be demand for that, so you might need to do this simultaneously with a train to generate demand. And this is where I talk about the importance of high-speed rail. So I'm usually a high-speed rail skeptic when it comes to redevelopment. So you're telling me that that they killed transit expansion in Macomb. Yeah, I mean, Macomb, my understanding, has a big not the city political identity. But this is also true of Oakland County. So this is a big political problem to overcome. The problem is that the state legislature usually hates the city. And yes, it's a Republican state, Democratic city problem that you can also see in Georgia, but I think it's bigger than this. In the case of the Rust Belt, I think that in this case even the suburbs have a not the city identity. It's very common all over the American North. So you see that also around New York and Chicago. If there's in New York and in Chicago, the city is understood to be more of an economic engine maybe. But even in New York and Chicago, you have this problem where the commuter rail is viewed as purely for the suburbs. The city is something else. And this has retarded the process of commuter rail modernization, just because the LARR thinks of itself as not the city and Metro North and New Jersey Transit and the MBTA commuter rail. and Metra, and to a large extent also SEPTA regional rail. So this is a lot of organization level stuff to overcome, and again, some electronics, but not that much concrete. But the organizational stuff is big. The entire point of public transit is that it's cheaper than cars as a system, but requires more organizational complexity. You need to get the schedule right, you need to get the infrastructure right, you need to get the equipment right, you need to get the development right. It is not something that will happen spontaneously. In fact, whenever you see places with very weak state capacity, usually these places also tend to evolve in an auto-oriented direction, because there's no state that will just say, okay, we're going to build subways, okay, we're going to build commuter rail, okay, we're going to even build BRT. And because of that, it happens all at incredibly local scale, and at incredibly local scale, while the local notables drive, everyone wants to be, I won't say everyone wants to be them, but no, some people want to be the local notable, some people want to kill the local notable, but the people who want to be the local notable are the ones that the local notables are gonna plug and view as promote as the real working class. So these places tend to encourage a lot of cars as a kind of way of broadcasting that you're rich enough to afford one. So you have all these cities. You have African cities where 10% of the population owns a car, but the streets are absolutely dominated by cars because the entire elite drives. So this is what happens when you have weak state capacity, even when roads require more public money than rails, because rails are public money that is debated at the highest level of the state with plans by the Ministry of Transport. Roads can't be done this way. This is how the interstates were built. But you might notice, the interstates were not the first freeways in America. The freeways in America, before the interstates, were built by local and state-level power brokers. For example, most famously, Robert Moses, but not just him. There were parkways that just accreted. Sometimes they were just turned into freeways, one grade separation at a time. And this was with local elite support, because in the, let's say, 1910s and 20s, the American elite already drives. So the point is that you need to have a lot of ducks in a row to get this right. High-speed rail could be, and I don't want to say will be, even if built, but if built, it can be a very good catalyst for this, because suddenly you're telling people in Cleveland, you know this Cleveland train station location? This location is about to be 2 hours from Chicago and 3 hours 15 from New York City. So let's make sure that people can actually access this easily. Now, there's a freeway, and they will say, oh, great, let's build parking rides. So first of all, you need to say no. Second, more importantly, the issue is not so much commuter rail as a feeder. So regional rail, absolutely important feeder. So that would be trains to Akron, not sure whether that was reduced. Trains to Canton, but that's not commuter rail. Remember, that's Regionalbahn, not the same as S-Bahn. This is not urban service. Urban service is going to be something different. People are mostly going to drive and park in one of the parking craters or take a cab. So what you need in that case is to say, okay, we're going to do a lot of redevelopment near the train station. Find the parking craters, turn them into residential buildings. And this also brings office development, because in the same way with San Francisco. With San Francisco, so in San Francisco, it kind of underwent a reverse job sprawl situation. So usually job sprawl works as the middle class suburbanizes, then retail catering to the middle classes follows the middle class. Then when you have so much middle class in one place and supportive retail, office moves there because they say, oh, great, all of our white-collar workers work here except for the weirdo with pronouns in bio and long hair. It would not have been pronouns in bio in the 70s, but it would have been long hair. And San Francisco kind of underwent that in reverse. The housing in Silicon Valley was so impossibly expensive that, and in San Francisco, it wasn't. I mean, it was expensive, but it was less expensive than in Palo Alto. I think it still is. Especially because you can rent, you can more easily live with housemates, I think. That a lot of tech workers ended up living there, and this is when you start getting a lot of reverse commuting in the 2000s and early 10s, and people were on the eve of the financial crisis. I remember people in urbanist blogs were talking about how San Francisco is becoming a suburb of Silicon Valley. But wait a sec, San Francisco is one of the best served job centers in America by public transit. So then all of the new tech firms located in downtown San Francisco or Soma, rather than in impossibly expensive and impossibly NIMBY places like Menlo Park or Palo Alto. So San Francisco kind of underwent this reverse job sprawl trend using the same sequence. The retail was already there. And of course, the existence of an urban CBD made this so much easier, and made it take maybe 10 years. They processed it for the suburbs took at least 30, possibly more. So with Cleveland, I don't think it's going to be as fast as in San Francisco. There's a weaker CBD, but there is a CBD. When Silicon Valley formed, there was no CBD in Palo Alto. When firms decamped, when firms decamped from New York to White Plains and Stamford and Greenwich, White Plains and Stamford and Greenwich had lots of rich people living there, but they didn't have job centers. When you had jobs in Westchester and in Fairfield counties, what you had was industrial jobs in places like maybe Yonkers or Portchester or Bridgeport. Not in the. I mean, maybe there were some local services in Stamford, but they were not particularly. But they were not job centers. These are more recent edge cities that formed again because of that trend. And my point is that with Cleveland, it's something that's going to start from the middle class, and I mean middle class in the European sense, not in the American sense of a person who is not homeless. Especially a middle class that is very mobile and connects with New York and Chicago, and this is going to be everywhere. So this is going to be Rochester. It's not going to be New York and Chicago. It's just going to be New York, but New York is going to be a lot closer. Albany, New York, also things around the state government. Detroit. I mean, Detroit has to do a lot of internal stuff, just because a lot of internal development, just because it's a much bigger city. But Detroit would be to Chicago. Indianapolis to Chicago, Milwaukee to Chicago, and all of these places, it's going to drive a lot of redevelopment around downtown. Redevelopment that is going to, for the most part, replace parking lots and two-story buildings. Because that's where they're. I mean, it's that or tall office buildings that you're just not going to replace. And so the idea is to get all the ducks in a row in which you build high-speed rail, not before, not after, but simultaneously with plans for urban redevelopment and local transit, which will need to use the rights of way that are fortuitously already there. But it is not an accident that they're already there. It is just these areas are in relative decline, which means that 100 years ago, they had the rail network that could today turn into this. And again, there are going to be maps. So I'm in Milwaukee right now. You might say that this is the easternmost line in Milwaukee. So how exactly are we going to hit this part of Milwaukee? I guess Shorewood. I don't even know what's in there. Again, so I'm looking at these cities. And Milwaukee is a city that I don't understand nearly as well as, for example, Cleveland, which I also don't understand well, but in Cleveland, because I've talked to some extent to Angie Schmidt and to Alex Vaca, I'm somewhat more familiar. And especially Rochester. But in Milwaukee, but it doesn't matter terribly much. The observation that you have this entire swath of stuff that is not served by an extant railway, that's important either way. I mean, maybe there's this disused line that you can kind of see the right of way. I think it's a trail. And I don't know if you can very easily restore it. And even if you did, it would not be the best place for the neighborhood. So the point, because you kind of see the gradients, and so again, you look for rights of way, you look for places to serve. Again, you're not going to shape. You can't shape. I mean, yes, you can do a little bit of redevelopment. Don't get me wrong. We're not going to get a lot of redevelopment. Remember the 70,000 jobs or so around Cleveland? That's not going to turn into 300,000. Forget about it. I mean, can it turn into 100? Sure. Can it turn into 150? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe, possibly. But I mean, but the point is to create an agglomeration. But that requires but first of all, it requires understanding that high-speed rail is actually useful for seeding residential around here. Second, it requires, it's kind of an elite shift, I would say. So a lot of the YIMBY versus NIMBY stuff needs to be understood as not class struggle between, let's call them labor and capital, or workers and bosses. In fact, these oppositions are irrelevant. What is relevant is something that I can call liberal versus conservative elite, and the YIMBY is the liberal in this case, but I mean it in the 19th century sense of, are you local gentry or are you the bourgeoisie, like the middle class? So, and these do, and of course it's not the 19th century, so you do need to understand that, for example, local lawyers are often part of the gentry. So it's mostly, let's call them people who are more mobile and have a more national identity versus the local notables who tend to be more NIMBY. And the point is that kind of what drives the possibility of redevelopment around here is people figuring, ooh, Cleveland is 2 hours by high-speed rail from Chicago. I can go there from time to time. And then with that also starts getting you regional lines. Again, it's going to start with regional rail as opposed to S-Bahn, so that'll be connections with, say, Akron and Canton, maybe an airport connection, maybe to Elyria. Euclid, for example, is more of a straight suburb, I think. So I think that can happen, but it's not going to be as intense. But again, this needs to be as part of at least some kind of regional or state or federal understanding that a bunch of things need to happen at once. So again, it is possible. It is a lot of organization. It is very difficult organization. It will not happen spontaneously the way that in London they kind of sort of spontaneously developed the tube. I say kind of sort of because Parliament did have to approve routings, and it did sometimes tell different firms, different companies that were building railways that they need to collaborate if the railways were along very similar alignments, or Parliament did sometimes tell railways to build transfer stations. But it happened more spontaneously than with planned metro and S-Bahn systems usually. Because at the time there was no other way to travel, and maybe maybe people expected more growth, and construction costs were very low. So in this case, you just need a lot of coordination. So it is possible. And again, you're using growth, but you're not using a lot of growth. It's not going to be Calgary. It's not going to be what LA should be. It's not going to be what Atlanta should be. This is going to be something very different, where there's small places of growth. It might even be not growth, but preservation in places where you actually start getting empty buildings, like Providence. But the point is to create the demand for housing and retail and office space around here. And again, it's not going to be a lot of DOD. I mean, we're talking a few thousand people, very low tens of thousands max, but that could drive more jobs. And then you need to also commit to not doing it as a cars and trains type of urbanism, like a lot of post-war Europe or post-war New York, where you build both, because there's no car capacity crunch here, not at all. The sort of bypasses that are being built I know lots of complaints from Streets blog, because I know that Angie complains about bypasses around nowhere, to the point that there are people in American transit advocacy who should know better, who believe in slowing down the state because they view the state as building more roadway capacity. Now, the thing is, the roadway capacity that is being built is completely useless. It's not like they're building another Katy Freeway in Cleveland. They're building bypasses around small towns of 5,000 people or 10,000 people. And I don't remember the name of the examples, but I know there are some in Ohio. So these are not things that are going to increase road capacity. These are just things that a local notable in what would be called a village if it were not America, in which country people pretend that they don't live in villages, that can say, I got money for our town. I'm so important. When my son bullies you in high school, you will take it like a man or like a woman. It's actually a thing. I mean, read up on Steubenville. Steubenville had a rather horrific story about what happens when the son of, I think, the mayor bullies someone. I think it was actually sexual harassment in high school, and the victim did not know that when the son of, I think, again, the mayor, bullies you, you have no recourse to justice. So you absolutely need to make sure that you don't build road capacity. And again, if you waste money on road capacity, you're just wasting money. You're not building road capacity. It's like saying that, the United States is spending so much money on subways because look at how much money is being spent on the Wilshire subway or Second Avenue subway Phase 2. No, the United States is spending a lot of money, but most of that is wasted. So if you loathe public transit on principle, you don't care about Second Avenue subway Phase 2 because that's just mostly waste. And likewise, if you don't care much for roads and if you want there to be fewer roads, make sure there aren't going to be roads here. Make sure there aren't going to be roads from make suburb to suburb stuff more convenient. But you don't want to. But the main reason to oppose these random interchanges and bypasses around nowhere is mostly it's just a waste of money. It's not building more roadway capacity. It's not helping any actually congested area. So as I said, it's possible, but remember the lessons of stagnant cities. So stagnant, so it's relative decline and absolute decline. There's going to be a historic railway network that you should absolutely leverage as a kind of regional rail network. So that's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3, be mindful of job sprawl and figure out ways to fix that. Lesson number 4, there's too much freeway capacity. Lesson number 5 is there's too much parking. Now lesson number 5 and lesson number 3 can sometimes be merged into redeveloping the parking lots. But that requires demand, and that demand might require. So I'm not going to say lesson number 6, build high-speed rail, because I think high-speed rail is useful. I don't think it is either necessary or sufficient. But it is very useful, I will say. So this is something that's going to be really useful. Again, maybe it's more specific to the Midwest and for the very rusty versions of the Northeast. So that would be Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh definitely has growth demand because it's economically stronger than, let's say, Cleveland. But also, let's say, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. So this is my spiel about public transit for stagnant cities. Thanks Neelam, thanks for the link. I'm gonna start looking at questions right now. There are a bunch, and I didn't look while people were, okay. So let's see. Do I know to what degree operating expenses can be are PPP adjusted? I don't know. The problem is that all of the reliable operating costs that I have are within the developed world. So yeah, sure, you can maybe try to look at edge cases, like a very overvalued currency like Norway and a very undervalued one like Taiwan. I think in Taiwan you absolutely should PPP adjust. Taiwan has an artificially weak currency to the point that I think the United States is threatening to label it as a currency manipulator. I do not know whether it's because of currency manipulation or because maybe people think it's maybe people think it's a dangerous investment because this might turn into PRC property. I have no idea. But in Taipei, basically everything should be PPP adjusted. Let's see. Gross point, okay. Yes, the streets have huge medians for light rail. This is useful, but light rail is money, and it's not $3 million a kilometer for running track geometry machines to fix up the tracks and electrify. It's 20 million per kilometer, maybe 30 million per kilometer. So literally different order of magnitude. So the Cleveland Clinic, yeah, that is a job cluster. Let me actually look. So I read this one. It probably is the largest dot, right? No, it's the second largest dot. The thickest dot is going to be somewhere here. The one with the 36,960 jobs, I think. So let me actually check this. So, add layer selection, no layer. And instead I'm going to do the ring, and let's see. So a kilometer around this. Oh shit. Oh, I see what, okay, so clear that point and draw this point. Or maybe it is actually 36,000, I don't know. But also the problem is with the Cleveland Clinic is just far enough out. I mean, my guess is that the model split for the Cleveland Clinic is 130% car, negative 30% public transit. Yeah, it's 40,000. Yeah, that's a 36,000 job cluster. 3696 is more like 37,000. Okay, so urban, yeah. So I was not thinking very much about let's say Birmingham or Northern England. I do want to say these are not auto-oriented in the same sense that Cleveland is auto-oriented. Cleveland, again, I don't remember the model split in Metro Cleveland. I can tell you that in Detroit it's about 1%. The model split in the metropolitan regions of Birmingham or Manchester or Liverpool, these model splits are in the mid-teens for work trips. So I believe it's something like 14, 15, 16, 17%. So these are numbers that are comparable to Boston or San Francisco or not quite Lyon, Lyon's a little bit more, but or let's say Nice or Marseille or Bordeaux or Toulouse or Strasbourg. So these are not auto-oriented in the same sense. Like they are auto-oriented, don't get me wrong, but they're auto-oriented in the same way that Chicago is auto-oriented, not in the same sense that Detroit is auto-oriented. Okay, yeah, so lots of people calling themselves rural despite living in large metropolitan areas. That is a thing. This is why so in America the identity used to be called suburban and is now exurban. So Diego, you know this from like the French, from the French. Do people in Belgium say urbain the same way that they use the term in French, like in France? Oh, Akron. Okay, not Akron. Akron. Okay. Birthplace of LeBron, who I think I have heard of. He's a basketball player, right? Is Palo Alto the only state in human history to force 2 top 5 companies to live? Wait, what's the other? Facebook left, right? Facebook left for Menlo Park, but what was the other? RIP, along talking to Angie Schmidt, yes. I will say that she blocked me on Twitter even before she became a school reopening zealot. Is maybe the best term. I sometimes So I do so. On Twitter, you can get around blocks if you look in private browsing, if you really want to look at what someone said. I do this about once every 6 months, because usually if someone blocked me, it's not someone who I'm gonna have any interest in talking, in seeing what they say anyway. But I think, but from like retweets, like my understanding is that she became a school reopening, Corona be damned kind of fanatic last year. But the blog was not about that, I'm forgetting what it was about. Not terribly important. Okay, the red line. Okay, so the red line in Cleveland, yeah, so that is a heavy rail line. It's a rather weird heavy rail line. It is, I don't think it was ever intended to be built as a subway. I do not even know if it has tunnels. I think they just picked a right of way, my understanding, and maybe they ran heavy rail vehicles on it, which in American terminology mostly just means high platforms. And but for example, the C train in Calgary also has high floors, high platforms, but in all other respects, it's like a German light rail vehicle. But I think the red line, just rolling stock, that is more similar to subway trains, but again, I don't think they actually did any tunneling here. It's just an extant right of way that. So a thing that they do in America sometimes is they will take a disused rail right of way that could be used for commuter rail, and turn it over to urban rail. I guess here it might be 2 tracks out of 4, and then the other 2 might be still mainline rail. So actually, so if you want to look at another red line, just the red line that I'm more expert in, so in Boston, so forget the Braintree extension, which is just bad. So you see the red line here? So the red line goes up to Ashmont, and from Ashmont to Mattapan, it's a separate streetcar line, just because there's less demand. Probably should just be turned to an extension. I think there's something about the bridges around here not being strong enough or something. So this was actually a branch line built by the New Haven Railroad, or one of its predecessors, that it just turned over to rapid transit because they didn't think that they could just run commuter rail as rapid transit with the frequencies and the fares. So they just sold it to. I do not know if it was called. It was not called the T at the time. I do not know if it was called Barrie or the MTA. But they sold it to turn into an extension of the Cambridge Dorchester Tunnel, not yet named the Red Line. And the same thing was done with Braintree. They just took parts of the right of way. The commuter rail was not even running at the time. They restored it later. So you do see this kind of usage of legacy rights of way in America, just not thought of as regional rail. It's purely urban, and and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not, because it's not technologically integrated with anything that can run through or share tracks farther out. They tend to not be able to use it for regional service, so that would be, in this case, let's say a red line to maybe Euclid is vaguely in the orbit of feasible, but certainly not, let's say, Ashtabula. Or something that you could hit Akron, or something where you could hit Lorraine, Elyria, Medina. So this is like the kind of importance of original rail, and the red line annoyingly doesn't hit the train station. No, the light rail lines do, thankfully, so people could transfer. How does it interact with the red line? You just want to, for regional rail, you want to put a transfer station here. For intercity rail, if you really want to, you can also build this transfer station. I don't think that it's terribly useful. You might also want to drag the line here for an airport stop if you really want to. Again, I'm kind of skeptical. Oh, okay. That actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, where you have areas. So here's the thing. In a healthy transit city, the median income of a transit commuter should be similar to that of a car commuter, slightly, or rather, it should be somewhat lower. Not too much lower, but somewhat lower, like in New York. Because you have two you have two opposite trends. The first trend is richer people are likelier to own cars. The second trend is richer people are likelier to be downtown white-collar workers for whom public transit is better. So if you're like, let's say, Chicago, I think, or definitely Boston or San Francisco, and then the median income for transit commuters is notably higher, not too much higher, but maybe 15% higher than that of drivers, then this means that you're too peak focused. So you have a healthy ecosystem of white-collar workers who work in the financial district of San Francisco, in downtown Boston or Back Bay, in the Loop, in downtown DC, and they take BART, WMATA, the L, the T, but that your system is very bad at serving all other trips. Because usually when you have a very strong skeleton around a city center based system, this should also be useful for diagonal trips. It should also generate demand for circumferential trips. Even without a circumferential line, usually the buses are going to be very powerful as feeders, and then lots of blue-collar commuters could use them as well. So this is a problem. Conversely, if the ratio of driver income to transit commuter income is too low, I do not know what it is in Cleveland. I can check. I know that in Worcester it's about 1 to 2. In LA it's also maybe slightly higher than 1 to 2. All of these ratios are rising in America because of the white collar effect, but in LA I think it's still something like 60%. So when it's so low, it means that your transit system is so terrible, even the white collar workers don't use it. And obviously these two bad trends can somehow be half and half, but usually when you're like New York, at least in the cases that I've seen, it's because you actually have lots of transit usage. It's not because, yes. So yeah, so in a place like Cleveland, you would have problems with white collar commuters just not using public transit because remember, 0.4 lots of freeways, 0.5 lots of parking, 0.3 lots of job sprawl, to the point that there's even a lot of white collar job sprawl. Of course, Boston has lots of white collar job sprawl, Route 128 for example. San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley is probably the biggest edge city in the world, okay? And yet, there's still a lot of white collar retention, and my understanding is that in a place like Cleveland, or for that matter Dallas, there's a lot more white collar suburbanization. So that's definitely a problem. Google was ran out of Palo Alto? I thought Google was always... I guess Google started in Stanford and then moved to Mountain View for, I guess, the same reason Facebook moved to Palo Alto, but I guess, I want to say Mountain View seems less NIMBY to me than Palo Alto, and Menlo Park seems similar to Palo Alto, but I guess my thinking of Mountain View as less NIMBY than Palo Alto dates to maybe 2008 and onward, and by then there was already a very large group of Googlers in the town, so people who were maybe for more economic development. Yeah, Mountain View is NIMBY by California standards, and Redwood City I don't know the history, but I know that in Mountain View it's because I think at this point maybe 40% of the town works for Google, and so this means that you still have the local notables, so the town and not the gown in this case, who have successfully NIMBY'd the expansion of the Googleplex. There's a bridge Google is trying to build that the town won't let them. But their power is lessened, I guess, because there are a lot of people who work for Google and think of Google as economic development, and maybe they have conflict with Google about things that are like that are Google labor issues. So that may be issues of harassment, issues of Google's involvement in government contracts that have politically adverse outcomes. I know that Googlers managed to get Google through like internal industrial action. They managed to get Google not to bid on, I'm forgetting what, whether it was a military contract or an ICE, ICE I guess it's called in America, contract. Oh, okay. About Google having moved. Okay. So it's already been more than an hour and a half. So if there are any final questions that are not about Google or about EMBSM, but about transit for Rust Belt cities, and again, I don't want to make this discussion about Australia and Canada, which are way more intact, or about England, which is in a different way more intact. Like if you can find me a place where you have 2% transit model split, then I will be happy to talk about it. And I think that the Friendship Army with the lowest transit model split is 3%, and it is something that is genuinely rural. If anyone has questions about Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Rochester, Buffalo, places like that, I will answer. I will try to end this at 8. Okay, so LA is a very different case. LA is a case where in LA all of these freeways are massively congested. LA is actually expanding the freeways. So LA is no longer building new freeways because it was successfully NIMBY'd. The Century Freeway with the Green Line in its median was the last, but they do widenings. So about demolishing highways, what should cities do instead of these highways? So build the highways to circle the city on the outskirts instead? No. Bypass it. I mean, the original sin, I don't want to call it an original sin, but the original sin is this constant cycle where you build a road through a city, you improve a road through a city, and then it gets congested, and then you build a bypass, and that bypass gets congested, and maybe even becomes the main road of the new development, and then you keep building more and more and more and more bypasses. Sometimes these bypasses exist, like I-90 here, doesn't go anywhere near the center of Rochester. Don't try to build new ones. Don't do this. So for the inner loop, I would just demolish the entire thing. I mean, also 490, but certainly all of the parts that are not part of 490, just demolish it without freeway replacement. What should be done with these highways? I'm less familiar with this than with transit, I will say. I mean, even though my blog has a very livable streets type name and not transit names, pedestrian observations, it comes from my trying to walk in Worcester a few months before I started the blog, and finding it utterly unwalkable. But my opinion on this is that this should be turned into surface streets. So obviously you don't want it looking like this. This looks like a gash, but you probably want it to be boulevardized. In some cases, you might want to develop parts of the freeway. So imagine that this bit were buildings. So imagine that imagine that you had the Union Street and you had a rather narrow street. So and I think these are also this is also parking, right? I mean, yeah, it's parking. So you also want to get rid of the parking craters. So imagine that you had this street, I guess Pitkin. It doesn't have to be terribly wide, and then in between here and here, you had development. Now, again, I don't think that Rochester has the demand for this, especially because we want to also remove the parking craters. In New York, I think when New York, if it ever demolishes freeways, it should be thinking of turning a freeway into 2 separate roads with some buildings in between them, because the city has very strong demand. But Rochester is many things. New York is not one of them. So I've mentioned that transfers in the downtown side are bad for ridership. Is this unavoidable? I don't know. It depends on very local circumstances. Ideally, the train station will also be the historic downtown, which is kind of the case in Cleveland. In Cleveland, you don't really need to transfer here. I mean, you can maybe transfer to the Cleveland Clinic here or here or here, but if demand keeps getting strong, you can do the Zurich thing where you actually build a loop tunnel. So instead of going whoop, you go whoop. That's how Zurich would do it, but Zurich is also, first of all, a low construction cost city, and second, a city where demand is somewhat stronger than in Cleveland. By somewhat, I mean massively. Oh yeah. I mean, with the curse of Sargos. I mean, in general, in Southern Europe, a lot of infrastructure expansion in Southern Europe just ground to a halt, unfortunately. You can kind of see this with the Madrid metro expansion. I mean, they're restarting the expansion at higher cost than 20 years ago, but it's still nothing as massive as what they did 20 years ago. What is my opinion about DMUs? It depends. My opinion on DMUs tends to fall every year. EMUs are just a much better product, a much thicker market. DMUs are also very polluting. You can do weird things like tier 4, but that's expensive. You can do battery or hybrid, but that's also expensive. Anything that you do to make DMUs not polluting will just make them as expensive as just electrifying. And especially with the life cycle costs. Remember, with the life cycle costs of an EMU are half those of a DMU. It turns out that electrification at about, let's say, $2 million a kilometer. I never remember the break-even point. I want to say that it's that the break-even point is 8 cars per peak hour. So that would be a train per hour if it has 8 cars, or every half hour if it has 4 cars. Cars are US sized, so 25 meters. I don't actually think, freight resistance, part of it is just Amtrak is being terrible, so Amtrak kind of taught people to be terrible, but with freight resistance, yes, there's going to be a lot of surplus extraction, but again, that's on the organizational side. So for example, more tracks are needed between Hudson and Cleveland because it's such a busy freight mainline. So that's 2 lines that are dedicated for, 2 tracks that are dedicated for passenger service. It's possible that NS will try to demand unreasonable things like a concrete barrier or something, or a large right-of-way separation, which they will blame on a fear of lawsuits in case one of the trains derails and hits a passenger train. The constant derailments of American freight trains and the flat wheels are a separate problem. But if they think the right-of-way is worth that much, this is what Veronica in the comments keep saying, have a conversation with them about what they think their right-of-way is worth. In California it's hard because of Prop 13, but we're talking about the Rust Belt, not California. The Rust Belt does not have Prop 13. Which Rust Belt city is the likeliest? It's hard to say because the ones that are likeliest are ones that are least likely to be called Rust Belt. Because they're the ones where you have the most potential for more demand. So these would be things like Hartford, maybe, Providence. Pittsburgh is a really good example. Pittsburgh is still viewed as Rust Belt, but wait 30 years. CMU, as I understand it, is not the tech of 30 years ago, it's the tech of today, so lots and lots of AI. Now, if AI does the things Elon Musk thinks AI can do, then Pittsburgh absolutely will eventually turn into a demographically growing city, because I have no idea if Musk himself has any research going on there, but the sort of people that he is channeling, rest assured that people who used to work for SpaceX and are now doing things like Hyperloop, so the ones who talk to me, I think, went to Princeton, but they're certainly aware of CMU. They've done work with people from CMU. They might have given talks at CMU. They might have colleagues from CMU. So CMU is very important in that, and that could turn into a thing. But I don't know. It's entirely possible that the sort of people who tweet at Internet of Shit and such are right, and all of this is going to flounder, and then Pittsburgh is going to tread water as it is today. Am I skeptical about hydrogen cell multiple units? I'll believe it when I say it. It's really high procurement cost right now. All of these are basically prototypes. Prototypes sometimes work, sometimes don't. We already have experience with technology that was supposed to be the next big thing and turned out to be a technological dead end. This includes the bi-level high-speed EMU, that would be the E1 and E4 Shinkansen, which were retired, I believe, even prematurely. Just because they had certain running problems, and I don't think they managed to get them to be faster than 240 kilometers an hour. And the tilting train is also a technological dead end. So not the Talgo or the active suspension in Japan, which are much less tilty and capable of only about 180 millimeter cant efficiency, but Pendolini are technological dead end. The Pendolino is seeing the most life at this point as a non-tilting 250 kilometer an hour medium to high-speed rail product. China has bought certain non-tilting Pendolini. Poland is buying them, but the tilting version, I think it's still in production, but it's not really being sold. It has really high maintenance costs, and this was something that promised to be such an amazing thing. And there was a lot of research being done in that direction for 270, maybe 300 millimeters count efficiency, but it turns out to be too difficult on rolling stock maintenance. So that's a tech that these exist. So yes, so it's possible that the fact that there's service in the United States. Oh, when you say CA, wait, what arrow service in CA? Because when I think of the arrows, I think of the New Jersey Transit vehicles. But it doesn't matter because North America buys this is not persuasive authority to me. Europe buys is persuasive authority to me to some extent. Oh, California. Oh God, they're doing this for LA area stuff. No, just electrify. Just take every single line in California and wire it already. California is a dense state. Yeah, the average speed for the Pendolini is low, and the reason is that they run on legacy track, and they're not tilting, so they can't even. Even if they were tilting, they wouldn't run at an average speed of 200 on legacy track. Instead of 100, it might be 130. Anyway, so my point is that you need to just be getting EMUs. And yes, there's a lot of resistance to electrification in mainline American railroading. It's a cultural thing. I don't know why. I don't care. Just get over it. I mean, when an industry is in decline, which again is often a relative decline, it will look to a mythical past. It's the same. It's the industrial equivalent of political MAGAism in Ohio. America was not a better country 60 years ago or 7 years ago than it is today. Detroit was not a better city 60 or 70 years ago than it is today. And the railroad industry in the United States was not better 60 or 70 years ago than it is today. So it's all about moving regions that are demographically stagnant, not back into a mythical past, but into a transit-oriented future. And on that note, I think I'll stop.